Welcome everybody to 52 Living Ideas. We're talking about Louis Sullivan's Kindergarten Chats. I think this is part 3. And today we start talking about form follows function. We got incredible panelists. So it's going to be Sherri, followed by Maritza, followed by Joia, followed by Rupali, and Rob is going to be there in somewhere. And that's going to be a surprise. Sherri, over to you.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Glad to see you all. I wanted to let you all know that I was sending a text to Recon this week, whining and complaining that we were doing too many chapters at once because there's such rich material that it was really hard for me to decide what to talk about. So thankfully, we've got all of us here. So everybody can grab their own part of the conversation and get this all in. And yeah, Rob's joining me here. There's a couple of sort of housekeeping things I wanted to talk about at the top. Not exactly housekeeping, but kind of signposting, I suppose. So we're reading 4 chapters for this week. The first 2 are Function and Form 1 and Function and Form 2. And I wanted to point out a couple things of each of these chapters and a couple of other details before I get into the visuals. I notice here that Les hasn't joined us. I'm hoping that he will. I have a feeling if he doesn't, it's probably because of Function and Form 1. He complained last time about how florid the language was, and I understand. And I wanted to point out that what we have in these 4 chapters, Form and Function 1, is really the teacher, we can assume Sullivan, rambling on about all these different details in a fairly repetitive style. And then the second chapter, Function and Form 2, is really remember this is a dialogue. So this is the student coming in and having some very clear thoughts on this. And notice this is the first time in this book, this dialogue that's been going back and forth between teacher and student. This is the first time when the student really has something to say. Very clarifying things to say that sort of distills what Sullivan has been saying in the first of these 2 chapters. Then we have the chapter Growth and Decay. Remember, he's a gardener. Always remember, he had, what was it, 100 different species of roses in his garden. So this is a man who thinks of growth and decay as a normal part of design and of life. Then we have thought. Of course, thought is getting into thinking, words, philosophy. So these are great little 4 chunks of chapters, and together these 4 really are the beginning of the real meat of what we're going to be discussing through the rest of the book. So notice now, and as we continue forward, that we're starting this process of seeing a student really have a dialogue instead of just confusion and worry and wait, I don't get it, what are you talking about? That sort of thing is what we've seen before. Now is the beginning of that major change, and we'll see that continue to the end of the book. Also, it's, to me, because, you know, this whole idea of form follows function, it's wrong for us not to look to examine that of Sullivan himself. So I was asking this week, what is the function of this dialogue that we're reading? And why is it that we have this first chapter on function and form where the teacher's repeating slightly different ways for some of us, and for myself, when I read this the first time as probably 19, 18-year-old kid, I have some very hilarious line notes in here. One of them was Rob's pointing to specific. I'm not getting to that one yet.
Sorry.
One of them was Walt Whitman threw up here. So there's another one that I'll get to in a minute here, but as a student, you can imagine that's a very repetitive, twisting, curling along itself kind of discussion. And if that's not your cup of soup, that's really not, it doesn't sit well with you. But, and this is a question I'm going to pose right at the beginning, especially to Rupali, is this like the Montessori golden beads? Where, if anybody doesn't know this reference, the Montessori math curriculum has little beads, little golden beads, and the children count them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, over and over and over and over again. And it's that process of seeing the thing firsthand yourself over and over again, that allows the student to make a real genuine firsthand connection, a firsthand concretization of what the material is. So when I'm reading it this time, that's now suddenly in my head. Is this repetitive description in function and form 1? Is this the function of it, to repeat and repeat and repeat, slightly different each time in slightly different way? Is that Sullivan's way of making sure that the student is not regurgitating exactly what's being said, but is able to make their own firsthand connection? So that I'm going to toss off to maybe Rupali for later. The other important note I want to mention here is keep your dictionary handy. I have been taking the opportunity of looking up even the words that I know, because I'm looking now for the slightly alternate meaning of a word that really enriches the text. So there's one spot in here where, I guess it's in Growth and Decay, where he uses the word, the fugacious nature of words. And I looked it up knowing what fugacious means, but I found that it has a specific terminology, a specific meaning in the field of botany, the falling or fading early. And suddenly that was like, wow, okay, so it's not just that it's fleeting, but that it's falling and fading early, especially. So look, when you're reading, keep your dictionary handy. When you're looking, if you could find the alternate meanings, especially if it has anything to do with gardening or botany or roses, then think about the meaning in that way. So those are little signposting things. The last of them was, this is really important because I keep hearing from, not from this group, but in the architecture field, the idea of form follows function is often taken literally, that form follows function. And I want to make sure that we all remember, that we pay attention in this chapter, and remember that Sullivan is a poet, and he's tempted by that alliteration of the phrase. And he doesn't mean that it follows. It means that they're intertwined and integrated. So I'm going to just take a second here to point that out. So these are a few lines kind of taken through probably these first 2 chapters that we're reading, not 2 chapters of the book, chapters 12 and 13 of the book. So here's the first section. The interrelation of function and form, it has no beginning and no ending. It is immeasurably small, immeasurably vast. And then we go on to here. A universe where all is function and all is form. And then here later on, form in everything and anything, everywhere and at every instant. And then further on, all is function, all is form. And then we get to the very beginning of chapter 13, function and form, when the student is talking. It seems to me that I should have gotten a clearer idea of your recent harangue on function and form if you had used half as many words. And my 18-year-old self wrote in the margin, boy, that's true. So remember, when he says form follows function, he doesn't mean follows in the logical sense or chronological sense, excuse me. He means that they are really intertwined. So then what I wanted to talk about was, what does this really mean in a visual sense? So I'm going to share screen here and pull up one of Sullivan's favorite, oh, I have to hit this first. Favorite things. We're going to pull up some gardening. Where is it, Rob? Here we are. There?
Yeah.
What did I pull up here?
You just have to have, yeah. No, okay.
Did I just hit this?
No, wait a minute.
Sorry, everybody. Hang on one second.
Hit share.
There we
There
are.
you go.
All right. So the mighty oak tree.
Maritza's smiling.
I can see it. Hence the reason for the oak, the acorns today. So when Sullivan is talking about form follows function, he means this, both the form and the function, so interrelated that it is, that you can tell what a thing is. So when he's talking, I don't think he talks too much about oak trees in this particular chapter. I'm going to take a page from Shrikant's book and jump way forward in a second here, read out of order, but just one little snippet for you, especially for Maritza, in a second here. But take a look at this tree. This is an oak tree. There's many, many varieties of oaks, but what is often characteristic about oak trees is that they are massive and broad trees. Even the side branches, their side branches are almost as large as other trees' trunks. And notice down at the root, as the trunk is all craggy and thick and rigid, it has to be in order to hold that vast expanse of its branches. And then that in order for that to be supported in a wind, this, what's called a root flare, down at the bottom of the tree before it hits the ground, flares out in almost like fingers that reach out in every direction and like grab hold of a big old fist of earth to hold it in place. That is necessary for this specific species of tree because of the nature of it. But that thick fist into the soil wouldn't really be enough. Think about the weight of this massive limbs that sticks way out. I mean, these can be almost like 100 feet in diameter in some of these full-grown trees. In order to have that kind of weight extend that far out, it can't just be one little fist in the middle holding the soil, because the soil would never hold that. So oak trees have a taproot that goes extraordinarily deep into the soil. And it's that taproot that works almost like the keel on a sailboat. So as this massive weight on the top maybe blowing around, it's that taproot that goes as deep as the tree itself into the soil, keeps it where it is. So all of these details about what make an oak tree are both the form and the function. So I'm going to jump ahead, and I'm not going to tell you where, because I want you to get to this later. This comes from later in the book. We'll get to it. I'm not telling you where. And this, I'll just tease you, is the student talking. You can bet your bottom dollar that this giant oak tree here never has stopped to inquire in its oakly soul. I love that line. In its oakly soul, how a pine tree grew, or a beech, or a hickory. No, sir. It has been true to its acorn from the time that acorn sprouted among the leaves it fell in. Nor is it now fretting and whining because the leaves of the pine remain green, believing therefore the pine to be a superior tree, as some people I know would like under circumstances. In our art, are we to follow nature's processes, nature's rhythms, because those processes, those rhythms are vital, organic, coherent, logic above all book logic, and flow uninterruptedly from cause to effect? And that we too, being greater than trees, at least we think we are, and possessed of heart, imagination, mind, and the sympathy of mind, and above all, gifted with spiritual insight, should use those faculties to give to our art a power, a vital creative beauty that should make with nature a harmony and not a discord. So you got that to look forward to. But another thing that Sullivan always talks about, he brings up the tree and it's in its nature. He also brings up vines. So here is a grapevine. This is not an oak tree. Then he talks about how a vine in its nature is totally different. And so its form is totally different. Instead of these thick trunk-like branches, these thin little threads stretch out into the world. And this particular photo actually comes from a site called, it's on my computer, called Science. No, it's an article about grapevines titled Structure and Function. So you could tell that somebody else is thinking along the same line. And you see in this picture here on the right, these tendrils reach out and they will literally, if you've ever seen a slow-mo video, and just you can YouTube this and find them. Vines like this, these tendril vines, there are different types of vines. There's some vines with suckers, there's some vines that hold their way up into the world a different way. But vines have this twisting kind of motion. They literally are flopping around in a circle until they bump onto something. And when they bump, they twist. So, and the funniest thing is they're sensitive to not grab onto themselves. You can read about that if you want, but so up on this left hand or this right hand photo, you'll see where that tendril has found some surface and then has twisted itself up. And so it's a completely different structure. The trunk, as it were, is almost the same thickness from top to bottom. The tendrils, these side branches, are delicate little feathers almost, little threads that go out. And then, so when we look at the little tendrils up close, we can see this sort of unfurling organic nature of how they do their thing, you know, how they get out into the world, how they climb up, how they bring their nature, they bring their leaves to the tops where the sunlight is. And I have one other really beautiful photo here of the tendrils. I love that you can see all the little hairs on this particular picture. But I wanted to take it straight from where Sullivan is talking about it, about vines and trees, and then bring this to another one of Sullivan's buildings. So this is the Wainwright building in St. Louis, Missouri, was built in 1890 to 1891. This is from the period of time when he was working with Adler, with Dankmar Adler. So this is an Adler Sullivan building. And it's brick, and I believe there's sandstone in here too. So this is a material that is really of this area of the Midwest. So it's fitting that way too. What I wanted to mention, especially about this particular building, I'm going to bring this up most likely in other chapters. So there's a bunch of things about this building that I'm going to hold back from because we haven't gotten, the student hasn't learned those things yet. So we'll come back to it later. But there's some things we have learned that I want to point out in here. And one of the things that I want to do is I want to mention here that Frank Lloyd Wright mentioned this specific building, calling it the first human expression of a tall steel office building as architecture with a capital A. So he was seeing this as the first time tall skyscrapers, and this doesn't seem tall to us today, but it was then, to see this as a tall vertical skyscraper building as a form of art. And that has, of course, to do with the expression of it. So what I wanted to mention here, a couple different things, because I'm not going to give you everything right now. Notice there's no classicism at all. This is very much, think of this as the time period where there weren't tall office buildings in existence really before this. This would have been the tallest building around. These buildings off to the side that you now see these as modern. This what looks like a parking garage and this office building in the back. That feels modern to us. But at the time, this was the tallest building and this was shockingly modern. So notice what we have for the structure, the corner posts. They're square, they're solid, they're unornamented. That was extraordinarily fresh and new. Notice that the function, remember we talked about this the last couple times about the function of, say, a department store. We can see that the first two stories have an entirely different function than what happens above it. Sullivan shows us that very, very plainly. Then we can see the buildings, what, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth, ninth, those floors, 3 to 9. I think it's funny that's 9 or 10 stories and we think it's tall these days, but it really was at the time. You remember elevators were brand new. That's what we're talking about here. Elevators were brand new. So these floors, 3 through 9, they have a very similar way of being treated. They look like offices. They are all the same. There is a sameness to them, so we can read them. The function is the same for that area. Then there's the very top story, which you may not be able to see in this photograph. I'll show you another picture in a second. There is a top story. Has a different function. And we'll talk about that more further on, but there's also the very, very top where the building arches outward in a cornice. You'll notice that these other two modern buildings in the background, the parking garage and the office structure in the back, there's nothing that caps off the top of that building, but those are concrete and steel. This one is brick. So brick and sandstone, most likely. So the nature of the material means it can't have water rushing down its side, because we all know what happened when the water rushed down the Grand Canyon, right? It'll erode the building. So that is a very functional need up there at the top. Then the question is, we talked about this before too, where does your eye drawn to? Remember that Sullivan uses ornament really to draw your eye. So the first place we see it is at the front entranceway. Now you can see the plainness of structures. Look at how plain these window openings are. I mean, that looks like normal today, modern. But then you see Sullivan's treatment at the entryway. That's Sullivan. It feels like Sullivan. And it draws your attention right exactly where he wants you to know. By the way, this is where you go in. Now we also see detail elsewhere. Here is an upper picture where we're seeing the structure. Remember, we saw those massive columns or of masonry on the corners. Then we have all the vertical members in between. They're slightly treated like columns, and we'll get into that a little bit more at future chapters. But that part of that secondary structure, that is, let me go back so we can see this. We go back here. So see, we can see the corners are very, very prominent. That's the first thing you visually see. The second layer that you see are the vertical members between all the office spaces. Those are structural columns too. Notice then that the third thing you see is these spandrels. That's between. So that's showing you where every floor is. Now I'm going to go forward so you can see that here. So now you can see these spandrels. They're actually set back from the interval columns, the ones in between. There's pattern on those, but you don't see that before you see the vertical column. But you can also tell exactly how many floors you have. So these spandrels have decoration. There's pattern, there's shadow, they're interesting. Then you have up at the top, this last floor with these little round windows. The top floor of skyscrapers at this time was ventilation equipment. You needed airflow. So all of these little round windows, you don't need to have open windows. It's not somebody's office. So it doesn't look the same as the offices. But it needs airflow. So it has all these perforated holes through the top floor so that wherever there's a breeze throughout the city, it's coming through that top floor and moving air through. But notice how these structures, as they're going up the side of the building, they look like stalks of plants. And this top part, I'll bring you in closer, looks like flowers. Now, I'm going to ask Maritza this question. Can you identify this leaf? These are oak leaves. And what I find fascinating is he's been talking about oak trees and vines. We have oak trees here, but do you also see the tendrils? This little intertwining, winding little detail is so much like the vine. And then the last thing I wanted to point out was, remember from the very beginning, Sullivan, his father was Irish. So that's part of his background too. So while we're looking in detail here at this flowering of this, the detail, think of this as like that grapevine that has climbed all the way up to the top of the tree and then flowers where it's getting its sunshine. So the ornament here, remember where Sullivan is coming from. This is an example of 3D Celtic art. So this is a typical patterning that you see at that time. So hopefully that, let me unshare here, stop share.
Before you stop sharing, I have a question. Could you go back one?
Back one.
It seems to me like a grid you could notice. Like
yes.
All these little lines. Does that mean this is made out of individual stones?
Yes.
Individual square stones that were carved with this pattern?
I believe so, yes.
Okay.
Yes, because you couldn't, I mean, this is, remember, this is an entire story.
Yeah.
You can't have an 8-foot piece of stone. All right, so we're gonna stop share. There we go.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Sherri. So next up is going to be Maritza. And Rob, you need to tell me when you'd like to go.
when do you want to go?
Whenever you like.
Okay, so let's do, so it's going to be Maritza, then Rob, then Joia, and then Rupali. Maritza, go ahead.
Okay. So I actually want to expand upon something that Sherri had mentioned, and she talked about, not viewing form follows function as a literal statement. And that was something that was kind of like a oh moment for me in reading this. And I find that I am almost incapable of viewing them as separate chapters, just because I do see the need to take the chapter on growth and decay and the chapter on thought. And I had to go back and reread the ones on form and function with the new data I now had, because it reframed the manner in which I was viewing those first few chapters. And I feel like, and I don't believe that I have ever started so many of my statements in reading a book with I feel. I just want to put that out there. But that is definitely something I have to say. This book just really makes you feel. Sullivan tells us thinking is a philosophy. First, learn to think, then learn to act. And he says that in the chapter on thought, which is the last chapter we read. But when you see thinking is a philosophy, you're just like, he just wrote that. And you need to go back and reconsider everything he just said, because it feels like that statement to me belongs at the very beginning of the first chapter, form follows function. And so I just needed to go back and restructure some of the things I'd seen. And so that's why with you, I say that first. Because what I'm getting from this, and now he does have, I will admit that there are actually form follows function. There's like, there are some sections that feels like, all right, you just are enjoying the sound of your voice here. Cut it out. There's a little bit of that there, but it's very little, so I can forgive him that. And what I'm hearing is that life is an iterative process. And that's a very, condensed way of saying something so much more profound. We live in a universe wherein all is function, all is form. And he says that so many different times. And the beautiful manner in which he says it at one time is that he says, all is form, all is function, ceaselessly unfolding and infolding. And you're like, oh, that's deep. And then he puts on his poet hat and he says, and our hearts, well, he says the heart of man, but I'm biased, so I'm going to switch it to our heart. And our heart unfolds and infolds with them. And that's another moment where you go into the corner just to meditate on life. And then it jives with, and this is in an entirely different chapter, but he tells us that, so if you have a heart that's folding and infolding with form and function, it sounds like there's a pattern there. It sounds like an ebb and flow, like movement. And so that's what brings, and he says it's ceaseless and it's unending. And so you're like, okay, so life is iterative. And it's just going to keep, you have to keep, and you improve upon it, right? And then he says that, there's a So the fragrance and the language of form and function is rhythm. And that makes total sense. If I'm thinking ebb and flow, I'm immediately thinking of movement of a rhythm. So the concept that we're like, because what I hear Sullivan saying to us in these chapters is that, you can't escape this thing that I'm calling form, and you can't escape this thing that I'm calling function. Whilst I am naming them, they don't require a name. They exist even unnamed. And he even tells us, he says, even if we remain unconscious of form or function, they affect us all the same. We use and we're shaped by them all throughout every aspect of every moment in our lives. And he uses an example of John Doe and talking about how, John Doe lived and died and he was unaware of form or function, but it still, I forget the exact word he uses, but that's my synopsis of it, right? So even if we're unaware that these exist, they are the invisible clay shaping us. And we are also shaping the world. And it's, it's kind of like a symbiotic relationship. And it's in the earlier chapters, he says, it's just so simple as you need to have a right start and a right finish. And to me, there's absolutely nothing simple about that. It didn't make sense until I got to that chapter thought. Thinking is a philosophy. Oh, right. Okay, now I get it. He also says the power of the individual mind is great. So what I'm hearing here is that somehow, if I can figure out a way to ensure that I'm thinking, then I'm on the path of that right start. And that just clicked for me and that made sense. And I was like, okay, so what now? And Sullivan is like, words are great. And he really does like words. There are these big words. And like Sherri mentioned, keep the dictionary close, a lot of big words. And he says some of the same things over in different ways here. But then he tells you that words are not that important, because what's really important is that you find real thinking. And I love that he tells us just reading a book doesn't mean you're thinking. You're reading somebody else's thoughts. Newsflash. And I mean, that's not really a newsflash, but it is. I think, especially those of us who tend to be readers, sometimes we forget that. You have to stop and find a way to make it your thought. And I love that he ties that in. It's what I'm hearing loud and clear here is that if I want to find myself with a right start or along the correct path, as it were, the way to it is not to drift. And he doesn't actually say that. That's my words, right? But that's what I'm hearing here is that real thinking is a phrase he uses. And he doesn't say unreal thinking, but he equates real thinking to finding reality. And in finding reality, then you're finding that ebb and flow, which is form and function. And it seems like it's a foundation that he's making here. And I feel like he's just gonna pile upon it. But I need to keep going back to think about, what here what comes to mind is the idea of soil. So I was describing to somebody yesterday what we did when we were converting abandoned lots into a garden space, a community garden for people when I was heavily involved in this initiative. And after we remove all the junk and debris and we sift the soil and the dirt looks like it's ready for the garden, we had to check the soil. We would take samples and send them to the University of Maryland, and because we had an agreement with them. And that's what some of this chapter is doing to me, in my mind. We're clearing out the debris because, you know, he's been with the student, he's taken away the junk that's been piled upon this lot here. And it's like, now there's no more trash. And so all you see is soil, and it looks like you're ready to start planting. But what he's saying, wait, not yet. Check the soil, because soil is everything. It doesn't matter how beautifully this, you know, sunflower seed grows. You can't eat it if the lead levels are so high as to be dangerous, you know? So I say to you, I myself am going to give you a big word, phytoremediation. And that's what I see here in this explanation of function and form and growth and decay and thoughts. We ourselves have the misfortune of living in a world where we have to take 3 steps back and we have to perform some phytoremediation upon ourselves. And for those of you who aren't aware of what phytoremediation is, it's when you're sucking out bad things or contaminants from the soil. And we did it using greens. So like we would plant, we used amaranth, just because amaranth, you could see it turns pink. So amaranth is a wheat and it's a weed, and you plant it on a hill and it does a fantastic job of pulling lead out of the soil. And what you do is when it grows up, you take it out, root and all, and you throw it in the trash. You have to throw it in the trash. But what we would do, because we would have children in the gardens, we would put, we always put signs, you know, not for eating, phytoremediation in progress. And the interesting, the fascinating thing about that is when you are pulling lead out of the soil, the first year, you see a little bit of improvement. The second year, it's way worse, way worse. And then the third year, you might get down to levels where you can use that soil. And that sounds off topic, but I swear, guys, it makes sense to me. So I'm hoping I can communicate it. The idea of being careful and discriminate and the way Sullivan says it, he says pseudo thinking and real thinking. I see it like this, like, you know, this process of, because if we start with pseudo thinking and we didn't even realize it, you're going to be growing stuff in your garden that it's no good. Because if the lead levels are so high, and we have to worry about that in Philly because, you know, it's such an old city. If the lead levels are so high in your soil, even if you're planting things that are not edible, the very nature of having children around the dirt could be dangerous to the children. So when what you're trying to do is build a pretty space, if you go about it the wrong way, well, now you didn't have a right start. And if you didn't have the right start, you can't ever get to the right path because you started wrong. And so that's what I'm hearing here. And I really, there's so many things here that, to me, I could read to you passage after passage. But the one other thing that I found to be like a fascinating statement, and one that I actually hadn't considered. as somebody who tends to, sweat the small stuff, it was necessary for me to read in black and white the statement that he says, and this part I wrote, he says, real thinking is always in the present tense. Reality is of, in, by, and for the present, and the present only. And that, to me, I've heard a couple different, I've been studying a couple different philosophic thinkings. And what I'm hearing here is it's a cautious admonition to be methodical and deliberate moving forward. And every word in that sentence matters. Methodical, deliberate, moving, and forward. And I hope this makes sense and it doesn't sound awful, but that's my take on what I'm seeing these are saying, that he's saying to us. And yeah, I'm gonna stop there. And if I have taken everybody off track, hopefully somebody else will fix us. Thank you.
You're completely on track. Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you. Really appreciate it. And it's especially wonderful because it's like you're kind of figuring out what the track should be and you're proceeding. So it's wonderful. Thank you. So it's going to be Joia followed by Rob and Sherri. Joia.
I want to say Maritza did not take me off track at all. She set me up perfectly for everything I want to talk about. And I love this structure we have here where we have Sherri and Rupali as our architectural expert pillars at the end. And then Maritza and Rob and I get to form the arch that goes across the middle here. So hopefully I'm just building on from Maritza and hopefully leading up to what Rob has to say too. So again, like Maritza, I am not an architect expert like Sherri or Rupali, but what I know and really love is literature. So this is one of my favorite chapters because we get to talk a lot about words and thinking about words and the creative process. So that's really what I wanted to focus a lot of my attention on. So first, I even just wanted to bring up a quote from chapter 11. I love where he starts to get into what words are all about. And he has this great statement where he says, if you are to use words, be reasonably sure you understand their values, their form, texture, color, their literal, their figurative meanings, their inborn tendency to shift. Words are alive. Drive them carefully, as you would herd sheep or handle spirited horses, else they will slip away or run away or stampede. And so I just love even this metaphorical description of what words are and that we have to drive the words and be careful with the words. I think he's even giving us instruction on how to read his own text. We've pointed out how Sherri was mentioning how so much has changed from Louis Sullivan's time to our time that we even have to be careful of how words have shifted from his time to our time, let alone how their meanings might have changed just because of the really innovative ideas that he's trying to express. And then also here in chapter 11, he had another phrase about, so when we think about words, a word captures an abstraction. And he has a really great phrase about this here too. When he's talking about architects, he says, most men in our profession are small-minded. That is, they lack the power of generalization, of abstraction. They lack the gift, the power to analyze that which is fugitive, the living, or to synthesize their common sense with steadiness and resolution. Indeed, they intermittently forego their common sense in yielding to the exigencies of quote unquote art, as you see. Now, a small-minded man gets hold occasionally on a partial truth, a fragmentary truth, so to speak. But because he lacks active sympathy with that partial truth, he lacks thereby the power to abstract from it the germ of a broader, a general truth, or to analyze out of it those 101 truths which the simplest state of feeling contains. And here I even wanted to make a connection to Ayn Rand and the earlier series we did on Romantic Manifesto, and hopefully Rob will come after me and give a lot more clarity to this. But Ayn Rand has a concept of rationalism, which she warns us against. Rationalism is the error in thinking when you essentially divorce your abstractions from reality, from concretes, from what's living. And one of the things I love about Louis Sullivan is he is essentially the exact opposite of rationalism. And what he's saying here, that when we're using words, when we're using abstractions, we have to connect them to what is living in whatever it is that we are using the words to describe. And I am one of the people who absolutely loves the poetry of Louis Sullivan's language. And Sherri, I have to say, you broke my heart with your comment about Walt Whitman threw up. One of the things that I'm planning to do in one of our...
Okay. 18-year-old self.
Okay, if my 18-year-old Sherri broke my heart by saying Walt Whitman threw up. Eventually, we're going to see that Louis Sullivan is going to break into actual verse in future chapters. And when he does, I want to do a whole discussion about Walt Whitman and what we might be able to see about how Walt Whitman might have influenced Louis Sullivan and how they're really speaking with each other, I think, when we get to their poetry. But already here, even in form and function, we're getting to a section that I put, we're getting to that point where we're almost like poetry. It's not quite verse, but we're getting there. And I really just want to read this because it is so beautiful, beautifully expressed, I believe, and even starting to make this point of exactly what form and function and this idea of creativity is all about. So here he says, "How many shadows do men cast? How many live in shadows? How many walk in darkness? How many struggle in their night? How many wander all forlorn in the verge of death's deep valley? How many are mired in the black pit? How many drag others thereunto? Great is the light that shines, profound the shadow that man casts upon his own spirit, opaque and moribund that man who gives forth not a light but a shadow in his daily walk, a dense material moving phantom he who stands before the sun and puts his art in obscuration. Stand out of my light, stand out of our light, I say, platoons of dead men. This is the day when strikes the hour upon high noon within a cloudless sky. Avast the sun, avant the clay that doth eclipse it. Shall the hour sound and no man answer cheerily its call? Shall the sun shine and no flower bloom in gladness? Shall the joyous heavens find no answer to their smile, but sullen turbid stares? It cannot be, it shall not be. For of the wilderness, I'll make a song of spring that shall dispel its gloomy wintry skies and icy snows, and make awake to sweet rejuvenance the lark, the soaring, singing lark that doth abide within the hearts of all the young. And I have to say, reading this now in the wake of the pandemic and how I've seen so many people respond to the current cultural moment we're living in, how many people around you are putting up these shadows? And how much do we need this spirit that Louis Sullivan has here? This line of, I'll make a song of spring. I mean, it's even perfect for the weekend and the moment that we're in. That we as human beings, that this is our call to create the spring. And I wanted to even juxtapose this line with one of what I think is one of the most beautiful poetic passages from Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. And hopefully here I'll even be able to make a connection with Maritza. So in Atlas Shrugged, people who have read the novel, there's a moment when the heroine Dagny, who is the vice president of a railroad, at one point is wondering if she can continue with all the governmental restrictions that are being put on her. And she flees away to a cabin up in Woodstock to think about what she's going to do. And Ayn Rand has this passage in Atlas Shrugged where Dagny starts thinking, the work of cooking a meal was like a closed circle, completed and gone, leading nowhere. But the work of building a path was a living sum, so that no day was left to die behind her. But each day contained all those that preceded it. Each day acquired its immortality on every succeeding tomorrow. A circle, she thought, is the movement proper to physical nature. They say there's nothing but circular motion in the inanimate universe around us. But the straight line is the badge of man. The straight line of a geometrical abstraction that makes roads, rails, and bridges. The straight line that cuts the curving aimlessness of nature by a purposeful motion from a start to an end. The cooking of meals, she thought, is like the feeding of a coal to an engine for the sake of a great run. But what would be the imbecile torture of coaling an engine that had no run to make? It is not proper for man's life to be a circle, she thought, or a string of circles dropping off like zeros behind him. Man's life must be a straight line of motion from goal to farther goal, each leading to the next and to a single growing sum, like a journey down the track of a railroad from station to station to, oh, stop it, Dagny thinks. And so if I put together what I hear Louis Sullivan saying with Ayn Rand, and I really think they are in conversation here with each other, Maritza talked about this idea of the iterative process, that this is what we see in nature, that there's growth and decay, that there are the seasons, and that if we are to be true human beings, we have to recognize this aspect of life, of the growth and decay, the iterative growth and decay of the process of nature. And we have to combine the uniquely human element, the path from start to end, the straight line, as Louis Sullivan talks about the form and the function, the purpose of the function and the form that is going to express it, and having that purpose and bringing that forward. So I think just bringing together the circles and the straight lines, that is what a human being, what being a human being is all about. And then just the last section that I wanted to talk about that also ties in with something that Maritza was starting to talk about. What was this idea of what actually is thinking and linking thought with the present moment? The present moment is the moment in which we are alive. I think it's one of the interesting things about abstraction, that abstraction is what makes it possible for us to grasp a past before us and project a future in front of us. That's the human, that's the straight line. But the living aspect is the present moment. This is the moment when we all are alive. And so that our thinking, if it's going to be real thinking, if we're going to have good abstraction, we have to connect that straight line of the abstraction with the present moment. And Louis Sullivan here says something about reading itself and about thinking that I just have to talk about. So he says, many people believe that when they are reading in a book, they are of necessity thinking, that when they listen to someone's discourse, they are thinking, but it does not necessarily follow. The best that reading and listening can do is to stimulate you to think your own thoughts. But 9 times out of 10, you are thinking the other man's thought, not your own. What occurs is like an echo, a reflection. It is not the real thing. Reading is chiefly useful in that it informs you of what the other man is thinking. It puts you in touch with the currents of thought among your fellows or among those of the past. But you must carefully and watchfully discriminate between pseudo-thinking and real thinking. Pseudo-thinking is always imitative. Real thinking is always creative. It cannot be otherwise. You cannot create unless you think, and you cannot truly think without creating in thought. Just as our present architecture by this judge our present architecture by this standard, and you will be amazed at its poverty of thought, its falsity in expression, its absence of manhood. Moreover, real thinking is always in the present tense. And then just to connect this with one last passage where He's going to tell the student in anticipation what characterizes a real architect. And a real architect is someone who really thinks and really creates. And so this here, I guess, is the tease for what I think we're going to see throughout the rest of this book of what it takes to be a real architect and a real thinker. And the teacher, Louis Sullivan, says, first of all, a poetic imagination. Second, a broad sympathy, humane character, common sense, and a thoroughly disciplined mind. Third, a perfected technique. And finally, an abundant and gracious gift of expression. And so here, I think we've really started to talk a lot about the poetic imagination. Maritza talked a lot about the broad sympathy, humane character, common sense. And now we're going to anticipate the thoroughly disciplined mind and learning more about perfected technique and the abundant and gracious gift of expression. That's what I have to say.
Wow, Joia, that was fantastic. I think this is the best one you've done so far. This is fantastic, beautiful. Next up is Rob, followed by Rupali. Rob.
Okay, so I hadn't planned to start with this, but because Joia brought up the connection to Ayn Rand, one of the things that really struck me, especially in this chapter on thought, is that this was being read by a young Ayn Rand when she's starting her research for The Fountainhead. So the passage that Joia just read about how pseudo-thinking is imitative and real thinking is creative. Well, there's Louis Sullivan, in the beginning of her, this is the beginning of her research. She's starting with this stuff. There's Louis Sullivan giving her the whole theme of The Fountainhead right there. So it's really interesting. You can see that there was, I think she had a lot of those ideas to begin with, but he's giving her just extra fuel for that thinking, because and thinking it as an imitative versus creative. I mean, that is so totally fueling the theme that she had for The Fountainhead. And there are a couple other passages I just wanted to mention while we're on that. Specifically, this is in the final chapter we talked about today, which is the one titled Thought. His idea that thinking is a philosophy. Well, that's another idea that she would really run with. About how he wants to teach his student to learn to think seriously, accurately, methodically, persistently, thoroughly, and fearlessly. And then at the very end says, bear in mind that you are not to think merely on occasions as a sort of ceremonial, but daily, hourly, all the time. It must become your fixed and natural habit of mind. So will your thinking grow steadily in power, clearness, flexibility, and grace, and you will ever thereafter feel what the spirit of independence and self-control truly means. So you can see how a young Ayn Rand reading this in the mid-1930s or late 1930s, while working on The Fountainhead, would find all sorts of things to feed into her own philosophy and give her material. Now, the thing I mostly want to talk about today is Sherri kind of has been peppering me with this question about form versus function and Aristotle's four causes. So I want to go over Aristotle's four causes and talk about some of the connections here. Now, so Aristotle, this is over almost 2,500 years, like 2,200 years before Sullivan, Aristotle writing about the four causes. And now he means something different by causes, and it's actually a different Greek word, not the modern word for cause, and it's a slightly different conception of what a cause is. So a cause in Aristotle's philosophy is more like an explanation. So he says there are four causes you can use. He really means there are four ways of explaining anything. That if you look at an object or an event, there are four different things you can look at to explain what that is and how it came into existence. So the four causes are material, formal, efficient, and final. I'm going to take them in that order. So I just want to sort of explain what those are. So the material cause is, what is the thing made of? So the example that's often used is, I think Aristotle himself may have used this example. I can't remember for sure. But the example that's often used is you have a sculpture, right? So what is the material cause of the sculpture? Well, marble. It's made out of marble, right? So in explaining what this thing is and how it works and what can happen to it, you would have to understand what the material is that it's made out of. Now you can see how this is a little different from our concept of cause and effect that we usually use today. Our concept is more like this thing happens that therefore necessarily causes this next thing to happen. So it's sort of billiard ball concept of causality, right? So you use the stick to hit the ball, the white ball, and the white ball goes across and hits the other ball, which causes it to bank off and go hit another ball and send it into the pocket, right? So this event happens, which causes that event to happen, which causes, and it's this chain of necessary, what each necessarily leading to the next. That's clearly not the case with the material cause. The existence of granite does not cause the sculpture to come into existence. In and of itself, that's not enough. It's just the material. It's a sort of it's necessary for the granite to exist for this to come into place. But it's an explanation of what the thing is, and not a cause, a full cause of what necessarily caused it to come into existence. The next one is the formal cause. The formal cause is the shape of the thing, the form that it takes. So, and you can see how this would apply to a sculpture. So let's say this is a sculpture of Socrates, or maybe it's a sculpture of Pericles. When we say, what is the form of it? Well, we say it has a shape that makes it look, it's the same shape as Pericles. Let's say great Athenian statesman, you're doing a sculpture of him. And so you can see how he's doing is abstracting out the shape of something from everything else, because this sculpture has the same shape as Pericles, but it's made of marble, whereas the actual real Pericles was made of flesh and blood. And then the efficient cause is the thing that's closest to what our normal concept of cause is. So the efficient cause is the thing that makes it, the specific action that makes something come into being. So in the case of the sculpture, the efficient cause would be the sculptor hammering on it with a hammer and a chisel, right? So it's the sculptor coming in with the hammer and chisel and causing this thing to take on this sculpture, causing the material to take on that particular form. And so that's the thing that the efficient is the thing that makes it, that causes it to come into being. And then the last one is the final cause. Now, final cause means the purpose for which it is created, the function that it is supposed to perform. So in this case, the purpose of a sculpture of Pericles would be to honor the great man by putting it in the Athenian agora or something like that. Now, it's that last one that I think is most interesting, because that's sort of, for our purposes, because that really sort of corresponds to the concept of function in a way. And the idea that one vital explanation for something is the purpose for which it exists. What is the purpose that caused this thing to come into being? And you can see how it is actually, the purpose of something can actually be the thing that is actually the thing that caused it to come into being. You did not, a sculpture doesn't come into being. A sculpture comes into being because people wanted that sculpture there. They wanted it for some purpose. They wanted it to adorn a public square, to honor a great statesman, or whatever else their purpose is. Any other man-made object is like that. It has, it comes into existence because it serves a certain function. So I would say, in terms of the connection of Sullivan to Aristotle's four causes, I would say the most important connection. So I don't know that Aristotle had so much the idea that, form and function, the formal cause and the final cause were somehow intertwined. I think he saw them all as a unity, but I don't think he had specifically that notion. But I think that what's most influential on Sullivan is simply this idea of a final cause. The idea that the purpose for which something exists is a fundamental explanation of that thing, and is also something that helped that thing come into being. And here's this passage that Sherri was saying after she got done. Oh, I meant to read this passage. And I said, don't worry, I'll read it because it fits in perfectly with what I want to talk about. So here's where he says, if you bear in mind what Aristotle meant by the final cause, that the idea that the purpose of the thing, the function for which it's being used, is a fundamental explanation and one of the things that help bring that thing into existence. You can see how that concept is coming through here. He says, if a building is properly designed, one should be able, with a little attention, to read through that building to the reason for that building. Or just above that, he says, I suppose if we call a building a form, then there should be a function, a purpose, a reason for each building, a definite explainable relation between the form, the development of each building, and the causes that bring it into that particular shape. And that building, to be good architecture, must first of all clearly correspond with its function, must be its image, as you would say. So you see that that concept of final causation, that the purpose of the building is, as he puts it here, is one of the causes that bring it into that particular shape. So the idea of the purpose of something as a cause of that thing is really very much taken from Aristotle, and is one of the inspirations for his idea of form follows function. So I'm hoping that helps answer that question for you.
Oh, that's excellent. Thank you.
Were you going to say something?
You go ahead and say.
No.
I have something else to say, but
no, I was just going to say, weren't you going to talk about
dialogue?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I had one last thing to add, which is so as the person who's on the ancient Greek philosopher beat here, I also wanted to talk about this as a dialogue, because for those who've read Plato and Aristotle actually wrote dialogues. None of them survived, but this is a guy who was trained in Plato's academy, so of course he wrote dialogues. That's just what you did. But Plato was really, and there were other people who wrote dialogues, but Plato was the master of the dialogue as a way of discussing philosophy. And this was considered to be the way in which you engaged in philosophical investigation and philosophical teaching in ancient Greece. Is you had conversation, the master would sit down and have a series of conversations with his students. You wouldn't write books. You wouldn't write, it wasn't about a textbook. It wasn't about tests. It was, there was what's called the peripatetic school. And the idea is that they walked among the courtyards and the trees and the gardens. And in their walking, they would have conversations. And it's very much like this book. It would be the master, Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, posing questions to his students, getting them to answer the questions, and then say when they answer, this is what's called now the Socratic method, the Socratic method, named after Socrates, is that when they give answers, you would question them about those answers. You pick apart the answers and say, well, that doesn't seem quite right because have you considered this? And then you lead them to make further conclusions in response to that. And that's very much what he's doing here. Now, the interesting thing is I very much, two things Sherri said I agree with, which is I think, I was just the overly florid, repetitive aspect of this, especially in function of form part 1, was really getting on my nerves. And then Sherri pointed out she thought it was deliberate. And then I started noticing that he has these little comments like, I would have gotten a clearer idea if you would use half as many words. He has his student putting in those comments. So it's like Sullivan's aware of this.
Yeah.
It's not that he thinks, oh, I'm this is great stuff. I'm being totally clear in my communication. He's aware that he's going over the top. And I think it's clear that that's a deliberate effect. And so it raises some interesting questions about what is the nature of this dialogue. And up to really chapter 13, before that, the student is very much like, there's a guy, when I was in college, we used to make fun of this guy. He's in a bunch of the Platonic dialogues. I think his name is Glaucon. And he's sort of the patsy in Plato's dialogues. So Socrates says something and Glaucon is always the guy who's sort of subservient and kind of he's the straight man. He's sort of like the dim-witted guy who's contrasted to against whom Socrates is contrasted. And he's sort of subservient to Socrates. And the student up to chapter 13 here has been a little bit like that. And it's in chapter 13 that he starts to say a lot of things in his own voice. And that increases, Sherri says that increases as we go on. And it really becomes more of a dialogue in terms of an actual exchange between two people. And the thing that I'm noticing about it is what seems to start happening here, and I'm just sort of putting this forward in planting the seed in people's minds, see what you think. That I think that what the first voice in here, which is, you think of the first voice, the teacher here, the master, as Sullivan. But I think, they're both Sullivan, different aspects of Sullivan, really. So the teacher voice here is the one who's poetic and florid and lots of imagery and this sort of endless chains of, why was one image? Why stop with one image, which you can have 7, all sort of tacked together one after another, right? So he's the poetic, florid kind of form of expression. And I'm starting to notice in chapter 13 that what the student starts to do is he starts to restate the ideas he's getting from the master. He starts to restate them, but in more precise and literal, and I want to say prosaic. He says he takes what is said by the teacher in prose, in poetry, and he restates it in prose. So that's something I want to sort of have you look for, which is it's sort of 2 aspects of Sullivan's personality. That he's putting things in the poetic and inspirational form, and then translating them into a more literal, direct, and down-to-earth form through the mouth of the student. So that's something I want to have us look for.
And yesterday, when we were talking about this at lunchtime, we talked about how that is so much Sullivan's architecture. It has that simple, clear structure with this delicate sprinkling of ornament and poetry.
And all intertwined and complex and ornate, yeah.
Excellent, thank you. And that's there in his thought too. Like when he wants, he can say things in a sentence with just clarity and power. But he thinks that the way to actually show you what that is to have that plus all its, efflorescence all together to see where it leads. Thank you. Next up is Rupali. And Rob, really appreciate that. That was just great. Both the pieces. Thank you. Rupali.
So let me just say that was an excellent presentation by everyone so far. And there is so much packed in these 5 chapters that, every person has been able to highlight 1 or 2 elements of what's in these chapters. He's talking about thinking. He's talking about education. He's talking about architecture. He's talking about nature. And within that, he's talking about poetry and words and how they string together, and at the same time, how they are not helpful when you are in the creative process. And it's a very fascinating way to look at the human mind and to look at how we live and experience life as we do. So I want to share with you that, he was highly influenced by, and we've talked about this, he was influenced by Emerson's writing and Walt Whitman and of that time. And there's also this movement called the Hudson River School movement. And I want to share this painting with you by Thomas Cole. And it's a painting called the Oxbow. It's a place in Massachusetts. It's a view from Mount Holyoke. And you can see this beautiful landscape stretched out in front of the artist. And in here, somewhere down here, is the artist with his easel sketching this vast landscape in front of him. And what Sullivan is saying is that, he's taking the idea from Emerson that nature is grand and complex. And in nature, there are, life forms that you can look at and learn from. He talks about growth and decay, and you see the tree that's broken and decaying. There's life by the water, there's the river, and often the image of a river and our journey in life is comparable. So these are some of the influences that also shaped Sullivan's thinking. And within that, he talks about, different forms have different functions, and there's an outward form, but there is an inner function. And if we look at whether it's birds, and that's where he goes on into this long dialogue in Form and Function 1, and he talks about the oak tree, the pine tree, the birds, the eagle, and he gives many, many, many examples. So I'm going to go back to what Sherri asked me at the beginning of this conversation is, why did he do this? And as Rob pointed out, it is on purpose. And in Montessori, we often talk about the 3-period lesson, and the teacher gives any particular lesson in 3 sections. The first period is called the gift. It's the gift that a teacher just gives with open arms to the student. And that idea is to raise awareness, to inspire, to create the sense of awe. And it's usually done through storytelling in a Montessori lesson. And the teacher, the Montessori environment is prepared with rich materials. And when I say rich materials, the materials have many underlying ideas within one unit. So if we take the environment as the world that we live in, the universe that we live in, and then say, okay, what are the lessons we are learning from? What Louis Sullivan is saying, look at this environment that we have. Here is the nature, here's nature that's teaching us what is possible, what adaptations are, what evolutionary ideas are. And the second gift, the second part of a Montessori lesson is to practice. And that's the second period where the student spends time taking all the information, the teacher's given all the materials that they have, and they're working on it. And the third period is when the children arrive at conclusions because they've made those connections. And it has taken 10 chapters for the student in this book to arrive. And it's here in this chapter that Sullivan first declares to the student, you are arriving. And that, as an educator, as a parent, when you see that happen, it is like the aha moment and everything that you're doing in the classroom, everything you're doing as a parent just comes to this one beautiful, satisfactory moment because the child gets it, right? So why is Sullivan using so many words? And, where the student says, well, if you had used half as many words, and I have an arrow pointing, why is he using so many words? So there is a reason for that. It's, and now as a Montessori educator, I can see the reason. Sherri mentioned in the Montessori classroom, we have golden beads. So they're basically a very concrete idea of the numerical system. You count one bead at a time. You string 10 beads together, that's your tens place. 10 units make 10, one 10 bar. 10 of those 10 bars make 100 square, and 100 of those make 1,000 cube. And so the child can see and feel concretely what it is. And it's a long process. They have to roll out a mat. They have to go and get one bead at a time. They have to set it out. They have to move the beads from top to bottom. They have to go get the numbers, put them together, and then write it. And often a young novice teacher will say, can we just skip the step? It's so long for the child. But the child has to do the work. And what Louis Sullivan is saying is you have to do the work of observation. You have to do the work of thinking. You have to do the work of putting it all together, and you have to be able to make those connections to create your own thought. And so this whole journey in these 5 chapters is learning how to think, learning how to be creative using our own thought. So here is a lesson that we do with our students. Our science teacher, whenever we study a unit on birds, she often does what are the features of a bird's beak and the talons, and how are they adapted. So now the bird, within the classification of animals, the bird is one unit, one category, but there are a variety of outward forms of that bird. And what Louis Sullivan is saying is, look at nature. It gives us a lot of clues about the inward form. The skeletal form of a bird is the skeletal form of a bird. Outward form, there are many different forms, colors, shapes. And when you're doing the ornamentation of a building, and Sherri did a fantastic job of showing the ornamentation, you can see that the ornamentation can be varied. And yet it is true to what the parent is. So somewhere along he says, you know that it's the student says it's like oh, here it is. The subdivisions and details will descend from the mass like children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and yet they will all be of the same family. So you see the similarities are there are many characteristics that are of the same family, but then within that, every species is unique. And it's because of the way they have to adapt. And then from that, we have learned how to make tools. And the children, typically with a science teacher, will identify tools and practice. It's a hands-on activity, so they can see how tools are made. Now, as much as Shrikant does not like me to go back to ferrous cement, and as much as Sherri and I love that, I'm going to go back to ferrous cement again, because I want to kind of talk about organic thought and thinking that Louis Sullivan talks about. And in his chapter about form and function, he asks, he says, what is an architect? And he really describes the architect as someone, first of all, a poetic imagination. And why a poetic imagination, right? In a poem, you have cadence, you use precise words, they are expressive. There are many layers of meaning within a poem. There's most poems that have survived through centuries talk about universal laws, universal human nature. There is a rhythm. And with that, we can comprehend just all the basic laws of what makes us human. And using that precise flowery language, there's some sense of peace that we arrive at when we read good poetry. And similarly in architecture, and he talks about the various art forms, whether it's music, literature, art, and then he says architecture. All of these can have that rhythm, have that balance, those basic elements that our human mind perceives. The second part is a broad sympathy, humane character, and common sense. And then a thoroughly disciplined mind. And I want to talk about Vishnu Joshi. I had talked about him last week. What is a disciplined mind? And it really takes practice. It's something that comes from doing it on a daily basis. And he was somebody who practiced yoga pretty much every day in the morning. He would wake up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and all of his thinking was done between 4 and 7 in the morning. And then he would go for a walk. Always, he had like a bird feeder. He had water lilies in his garden. He had trellises with, he had trellises with pepper and vanilla vines, climbing palm trees, and just very small things within his own garden. And on his walk, one day he found a dead tree. He had it chopped, brought it to his place, made a little water fountain in the courtyard. And to add, the form of the log looked like an old camel's mouth. And so he borrowed dentures from his brother and stuck them in the log. And it just was, a sense of humor that you could see when you walked into the courtyard. So you have these technical skills. He's mastered a technique so that concrete would be plastic in his hands, and a gift of expression. So how do you take that abstract idea? How do you take the ideas from nature? And Emerson, in his writing, he talks about, when Emerson says nature instructs and inspires, it helps the artist to see and create. But art cannot imitate nature directly. It has to be translated in an abstract form. And so what Louis Sullivan is trying to do here is he's saying, okay, let's look at nature and how do you translate nature in an abstract form? Louis Sullivan also talks in Growth and Vitality about how architecture is alive. It is something that you experience with all of your 5 senses. And if that is so, then what should a building look like? So here is something children love to do. This is pre-COVID at our school. Now they can't blow bubbles together, but you can never go wrong with children and bubbles. And soap bubbles. So here they are making soap bubbles, and you can see, Joia talked about spherical shapes in nature. It's a very universal form. It comes from a point and becomes a sphere. And when you have soap bubbles together, there is this play of tension and compression within them, between the walls of the bubbles. So something that is experiential. And why does Louis Sullivan have this elaborate process? Again, here is a student taking a journey in discovering the strength of a material or strength of how structures work. They are experiencing it firsthand by creating soap bubbles themselves. Well, these soap bubbles, if you put them together, on the top left corner, you can see a terracotta model of soap bubbles put together. And you have the walls pushing at each other at certain points, and otherwise there are some bigger bubbles and smaller bubbles within that. And to the bottom left is a picture of a cave, the interior of a cave. And you can see, they are organic shapes, but you have those stalactites going from top to bottom. In nature, you can see many shapes, and I'm going to focus on the pumpkin. A pumpkin, it's a shape in compression. There are no unbalanced forces. If you stand on the pumpkin, you sit on the pumpkin, the forces all transfer to the ground. And when you have a shape in compression like that, then you can build a structure that has a similar shape. And to the right are all these circles now becoming little ellipsoids or ovoids. And if you put them together, you can have a continuous flow through them and going into a straight line. Joia, I like your image of taking circles and making it into a straight line. I've not thought about this, but this is from my final year thesis, and it is a representation of a building in India that I'm going to talk about. So Vishnu Joshi, Vishnu Joshi is a structural engineer. He was not an architect. He was a structural engineer, but I bring his example in architecture because he kind of personifies what Louis Sullivan is saying. And having a creative mind. So he was tasked with the job of designing a structure like a cave for an art gallery. And in India, there are cave structures where there are paintings and sculptures in caves from centuries ago. And the goal for this particular project was to evoke that that feeling of the cave for this art gallery. And this art gallery is located in a city called Ahmedabad. And here is the top view of that cave structure. So you can see all those bubbles. I'm just going to go back one slide. So you see those bubbles that we have, and you can see the flow of the small bubbles and the big bubbles. And here it is in a concrete form. Now, to give an idea of form, you also need a material that is going to take that form. So understanding what the material does, understanding how does wood behave, how does stone behave, how does concrete behave, how does glass behave, understanding the properties of material is where the architect needs to have the technical skills. And although this book is written for a student of architecture, it applies to every field. It's a very universal way of thinking that, you know, having a goal, having a purpose is important. Now, here is the inside of the structure, and you can see that the reason why the columns are not just straight but at an angle is because they have to support those bubbles. And if you go back and look at the organic shape of the bubbles, you can see that those are not necessarily straight lines going down. And if you've ever made bubbles, you can see that the surfaces between the bubbles, they have to balance themselves. And sometimes they're vertical and sometimes not. And so you can see the shape of the columns is to take those forces down to the ground. And the reason this was possible to create and evoke a feeling of being in a cave is because there was a material that the engineer could use and the architect could use together to make it possible. And so this is what the cave looks like from above, and it's partially submerged below, and you get the feeling of going down into a cave. And once you're inside, the only light that's coming is from the skylight. So you truly feel that you are inside the cave. So then it brings me to education. So that's the architectural part of, okay, how do you take a form? How do you take something from nature? How do you take something from your daily experience and through observation make a form? But one of the things that Sullivan is talking in this, in his chat, in all of these lectures is the process of thinking. And there's one part where he talks about a student and he says, you know, the student says, I'm going to try to keep on it. It's rather fun to do your own thinking, isn't it? And this is, you know, as a teacher, as an educator, I find this when, you know, initially children are repeating, they're just parroting what others are saying. But once they start making discoveries, as young as they are in kindergarten, they can make their own discoveries and say, aha, this is how this works. This is why 2 + 2 is 4, or 1 + 3 is 4. And I can come to these conclusions by using those beads. That is a moment of confidence for a child, that I can think for myself, right? Well, there's another aspect of education, which is, you know, I was very surprised to read it in Louis Sullivan's work, because this book was written in the 1800s and we are now in 2021, but this is still true. He says, it is only the conventional teacher of architecture who could tell you that you are a dullard by birth and an imbecile by predestination. I tell you, you were born all right, and that you have the powers of which you are not aware. Every lad has, and might develop them if his parents did not ask him every 5 minutes how much he is getting and if he can't get a raise next week. To me, I just couldn't believe that sentence. You know, we still have that issue even now in education, and parents are worried about grades. At our school, we have a student who came to us at 5 years of age because the school that he was going to, the teachers told his parents in front of him that he was not teachable, and they had to find another school. And when the parents came to us, they said, well, our child has a problem. And our teacher said, well, let him spend a day at our school and we'll find out. And the teacher said, he's just a fidgety boy and we can work with him. And now he's in 4th grade. Another student came to us where in 1st grade, the teacher told the student and the parents that he would never learn to read. He just had no way to read. And this was from a parochial school because he didn't fit the mold and didn't follow along the way that the teachers expected him to learn. And the mother just, you know, when she came for a visit to our school, she cried and said, I don't know if I'm doing the right thing, but I need to move him from that school. So the parents sometimes know it and sometimes don't because they're depending on the educators to tell you what's right or wrong. And then recently, for a 10th grade boy in India, a parent told me that he's failing and he's failing because he's dull. And I said, well, that's not possible. And one of our teachers has been working with him and a student who could not read English is now he's done Midsummer Night's Dream, he's done Romeo and Juliet, and now he's doing Merchant of Venice and is absolutely enjoying. And yesterday when I spoke with him, he said, I love to be Shylock. And I said, why is that? And he said, well, I can act out all of those emotions. And so what Louis Sullivan is saying is, I tell you, you were born all right, and you have powers of which you are not aware. Your parents are not aware of it. Your teachers are not aware. The 2 boys I mentioned before, whose teachers told the parents that they could not read, are now the class presidents of our upper elementary classroom. And they were elected by the rest of the students because they are well behaved, they know what to do, they are engaged in their learning. One of the boys did a recent project on all the presidents of the United States and was able to research all of them. He was reading the encyclopedia and books that are not meant for 4th grade or 5th grade. He was reading books written for adults. So what Louis Sullivan is saying, that every human being has that germ, that seed in him and her. It just needs the right fertile soil. It needs the right environment to thrive. And one of the goals of education is to help the child think for themselves. And how do you do that? In his conversation about thought, Maritza read that section about pseudo thinking and about these are not your thoughts. You are merely repeating what the author is saying. And so he makes a distinction between words and thoughts. And he says the thoughts can go at a speed of, you can travel to Sirius and back. And you see that within, when you're working with children. And as they get older, they kind of, that ability to imagine is stifled because parents and educators are sending them signals or giving them signals, whether verbal or non-verbal, that's impossible. Don't think about that. And now what you're doing is by saying that we are stifling the creative mind, we are stifling imagination. The next chapter is going to go into imagination. So I'm not going to talk about that. But what thinking does for children, for adults, is it allows them to make observations. And observations, so when we go back to Emerson or Louis Sullivan, when they're talking about observe what's going on in nature, make those connections. It's the same thing in a Montessori environment. The environment is rich so that children can see the connection between science and art, physics and math and language and science, and they can put those connections together. And Louis Sullivan says, when you're thinking, it's good for health and happiness. So joyful children and joyful human beings are just a consequence of thinking your own thought. So that brings us to Maria Montessori. And the reason I bring Montessori together, I said to Shrikant last week after our conversation that this book seems to be a full circle for me. I started with architecture and ferrocement, got into education as a parent and teacher, and I'm back again into architecture and ferrocement. So the goal of Montessori is that children learn through their senses, and so giving them those sensory experiences on a daily basis. Maria Montessori believed that there's a hand-to-brain connection, which, the hand-to-brain connection and repetition. So you see the same concept in many different ways. If you're studying circles, you're going to see them in art, you're going to see them in math, you're going to see them in physics, you're going to see them in science, and they bring together the children's learning in a very concrete manner, and those abstract ideas are not hard to grasp. Then that also helps children develop creative thinking because they're seeing all these connections and they can create something of their own. One of the things Louis Sullivan says to the student in the book is, he says, let's take this journey together. That the educator and the student are making discoveries together. And in a Montessori classroom, you'll see that the teacher's not standing at the front of the classroom giving a lecture as a know-it-all, but is working with the student, is allowing the student to make discoveries. And often I'll say to a child, wow, I've never seen that before, because every child interprets the materials in different ways. So the goal of education that Louis Sullivan is saying, or Maria Montessori is saying, is to prepare students for life. And for that, you need to do deep work. So I'm going to bring it to the present, because when I talked to my husband about, my husband and Rohit and I talked about this book, and he's like, okay, how do I put it in my practice in daily life, right? Because this Louis Sullivan's work is old and it is very, very true, but how do we make it current? There is a book by Cal Newport called Deep Work. This artist, Doug Neal, he is a visual artist and he does sketch stories. So he talks about this book in 4 sections that, the very first thing is to eliminate all that is unnecessary and think about things that really give you deep value. Focus on those things. The other is the making time for things that are important to you and dividing your day and your workspace. In his book, Deep Work, Cal Newport also talks about what should an ideal work look like? What should the architecture look like for thinking? And so you have common spaces, but then when you're thinking, you need your own space that you've created, whether you want your piano in there, whether you want your sketchbook in there, all of that to help you think, because every person thinks in a different way. And what is your rhythm? When do you wake up? When do you sleep? How are you dividing your day for deep work, for thinking? And he says you have 8 hours to do your work. Okay, even if for 4 hours you're involved in deep thinking, you're creating a habit of mind that you can use on a daily basis. And journalistic. So wherever you are, you can keep thinking about whatever issues, problems, ideas you have. And Louis Sullivan ends his chapter on thought with this. The more you think, the more you will delight in thinking. The more you contemplate, the more you'll delight in contemplation. The more you act, the more you will delight in action. And it's a feedback loop. It gives you inner satisfaction, and that thinking is a lifelong process. It's not something that you just do and stop. And therefore, I really like this image of Maria Montessori, where she is equally interested in what the child is doing, because this is a lifelong process. All of us can learn by observing and by thinking, and that leads to a creative mind, that leads to imagination. So I will stop here. And Sherri, I don't know if I answered your question.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. That was great. Now we have about 20 minutes or so. So we can go ahead. We got 25 minutes. So let's go ahead and ask questions. So it's going to be Joe followed by Rohit. Folks, just go ahead and type exclamation mark to ask questions. Please try to keep questions as brief as possible so we can get to as many questions as possible. Joe.
A fantastic presentation by everyone again, and my question is for Rob. Is that in thinking about form follows function, is it appropriate to think about it like if you're thinking about it in terms of Aristotle's categories, formal cause follows final cause? And I understand that kind of all of the Aristotle's four causes are like kind of intertwined with one another, and that they're but at the same time, if I were to extract form follows function, I kind of see form and the final cause, like the purpose, the form and the purpose, as the two that relate to form and the function. Is that a way of thinking about it?
Well, okay, so I'm going to take something Sherri said, which is I think it wouldn't be. Well, no, I'm learning. I would say that formal cause follows final cause, but that formal and final cause are interrelated, that they're two ways of looking at the same thing.
Right.
Because the way I see it, I think the point Sullivan's making about form follows function is really just an application of the concept of the final cause. The idea that the purpose for which something is used is one of the causes that brings it into being. I think that's the essential idea of the final clause, and I think that's what Sullivan is putting into form here in applying to architecture. So I think now but then again, it goes to the fact that all of Aristotle's four causes are just different ways of looking at and explaining the same thing. So they're necessarily integrated together.
All right. Thank you. Jonathan has infinite number of exclamation marks coming from the other side of the earth. So Jonathan, go.
Like he does.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, that was so good. I can see how much depth there is in this book, and I made so many mental connections. But let me head straight into questions. So this idea of looking at how organic and inorganic thoughts, from what I understood so far, so organic is almost purposeful. It made me think of from Joia's presentation, actually from a completely different thing, where she described good literature as encyclopedic, and Ayn Rand in the Romantic Manifesto talking about the size of the integration as being important. So am I right in saying that organic is when Louis Sullivan is using the term organic, he means both purposeful and integrated, and then also the relationship between discipline and purpose. Maybe I'll just leave it there and give you guys the chance to reply now.
Can I jump in first here? And Jonathan, thank you very much, because that topic is at the top of my list of things that I wanted to talk about that I didn't get to. So thank you. These two of these chapters are the first time that we're hearing Louis Sullivan use the word organic in the relationship to architecture and in the relationship to thought. And I have written here, this is where it begins and he starts the definition. You're on the right track though, in understanding what you're thinking, the way you described it, but it gets richer and richer as we go on. And I don't want to pull that rug out from you. I want you to let that unfold along with the rest of the chapters. But the way I like to put it is for people new to that part, think when you're thinking of organic, for Sullivan, it's much more Darwin and much less Whole Foods. I don't know if you have Whole Foods where you are, but much less organic food and much more Darwin's theory of evolution, if that kind of helps frame it for you. But you're on the right track.
Wonderful. Next up is going to be Rohit, Laura, and Ash. Rohit.
I had the same question, organic, and I had actually written down, is this evolving? Does this mean evolving? And I think you answered it, Sherri. So I think that's pretty good. And I'll hold my horses. I actually wanted to see what others felt about it, but if you're running short on time, that's fine. And I'll hold my horses on reading further to develop the notion of what he really means by organic.
Wonderful. And we will have plenty of opportunity
Sure.
to do it, because the rest of the book is just kind of, builds on this is a core concept of his.
Okay.
Next up is Laura. Laura, what's your question?
Okay, well, I really appreciate all of this, and I put it through my own sieve and find myself thinking of form, relating it to a problem, and function relating to the operationalization of the form. And so it's a problem-solving model again. And so I see that generalization for everything. And I also see the idea of giving children openness to think and so forth, and look at the Montessori method. So I'm just questioning whether the kind of model given to kids to ask the question, what is it? What are we working with? What do we want to know? Can that be applied in this into the Sullivan kind of thinking, so that we would have an educational model that would apply from pre-K to grade 12, that would solidify the process that teachers have, and would give kids the ability to be wherever they are in the spectrum, that we wouldn't need grades and stuff like that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura. Rupali, you want to take that?
I think that, throughout the book, Louis Sullivan kind of slowly adds what education should be. And I have a string of, notes where it says education, education. And then if I look at them together, you can see a continuous thought, although it appears in different chapters. It is very difficult, though, to apply this on large scale to public school systems, I think, just because of the bureaucratic nature they have. But in many small schools, especially Montessori schools, or it is successfully applied, where children are taught to think, children are encouraged to try out things and practice and make their discoveries. So I feel that it is possible. I mean, look at it. He wrote the same thing in 1800s, and here we are talking about the same issues that he correctly pointed out years ago.
Wonderful. Next up is Ash.
Yeah, so I'm just kind of trying to draw a thread from all the different presentations by the panelists. So I guess this is directed to any of them that want to comment. But first of all, I really liked what Maritza was talking about the ebb and flow of natural processes and the kind of continual unfolding and infolding. That's like the videos of vine growth that Sherri mentioned. And I'm really glad that Joia brought up that passage from Atlas Shrugged about how Rand was trying to make this distinction through Dagny about how circular motion is appropriate to nature, and the straight line is the appropriate motion to man. But of course, human beings are part of nature. So while there is a distinction there, I am kind of looking for the connection there as well. And of course, in these natural processes.
Can I quickly answer that? Is the spiral.
Yes, that's where I'm going with this. So
that's exactly what I was going to say too, that it's the straight line and the circle together. That's
right. So like the circular processes are not like these static repeating into infinity, like, you know, these cycles in nature, they iterate and they progress and they evolve. Whereas what differentiates us is that we just do that better because we can do it deliberately and consciously, right? And so that kind of ties in with the rhythmic aspect of deep work that Rupali mentioned. So yeah, I guess that's basically you stole my thunder.
Oh, sorry about that. Sorry.
No. Yeah. So basically, it's like, yeah. So really, it's just, you know, from a certain perspective, like a very tight spiral looks like a circle, and a very elongated spiral looks like a straight line. But of course, you know, Ayn Rand, she's using the symbol of the railroad tracks as kind of her symbol of the straight line. But of course, a railroad track, you know, within a certain context and from a certain perspective, it's a straight line from one place to another, but it's on the surface of the earth, so which is curved, of course. So all of these things I just look at as different levels of spirals, kind of like, I love the passage that Sherri read about the intertwining of form and function at all of these levels, from the minutest to the grandest scale. And it's like, you know, the form of the oak tree is being recapitulated at every level, from the trunk to the branches that look like just almost smaller versions of the trunk, to the leaves, or maybe it's the other way around. I don't know. But yeah, so it's all a spiral.
Wonderful. Wonderful. I just want to add one thing. Folks, if you have questions, you can go ahead and type exclamation mark. I just want to read one thing. One of the things to kind of keep in mind is how Louis Sullivan looks at the entire context. And there are many, many, many functions that are operative at many different levels, and all of them are operative. So there is like functions and forms happening at multiple levels. So, you know, I'm just going to read this out. Functions are born of functions and in turn give birth or death to others. Forms emerge from forms and others arise or descend from these. All are related, interwoven, intermeshed, interconnected, interblended. They exosomos, oh, I don't know how to pronounce it. They sway and swirl and mix and drift interminably. They shape, they reform, they dissipate, they respond, they correspond, they attract, they repel, they coalesce, they disappear, they reappear, merge, and emerge, slowly or swiftly, gently or with cataclysmic force, from chaos into chaos, from death into life, from life into death, from rest into motion, from motion into rest, from darkness into light, from light into darkness, from sorrow into joy, from joy into sorrow, from purity into foulness, from foulness into purity, from growth into decadence, from decadence into growth. All is form, all is function, ceaselessly unfolding and infolding, and the heart of man unfolds and infolds with them. All is function, all is form, but the fragrance of them is rhythm. The language of them is rhythm. For rhythm is the very wedding march and ceremonial that quickens into the song of the unison between form and function, or the dirge of their farewell as they move apart and pass into silent watches of the wondrous night we call the past. So goes the story on its endless way.
And then the student comes in and says, the function then will flow to the minutest detail of form in orderly sequence, as surely as the sap flows to the tip of the slenderest tendril of the vine, to the tips of the outermost leaves of the giant forest tree.
Wonderful, wonderful. Folks, if you have questions, go ahead and type exclamation mark. Otherwise, Jonathan has infinite number of questions. Jonathan, you're next. Just one question at a time, though.
Yeah, okay. Sure. Let's see which one I want to go to. I also really loved Joia's what she was talking about, looking at the circle and the straight line of man, and the insight that you just gave about the spiral got me thinking a lot too. One thing that Joia said that I didn't fully get my head around, but I found really interesting. So this idea of thinking should be in the present And how does, because abstractions are, you know, like abstractions can be hypotheticals, or they can be about the past, and they can encompass more than is in front of you. And so what would then, like, how would you think in the present, if that may, like in abstractions in the present, if I'm getting that right?
Who would like to take that? Go ahead.
I'll take it because it seems to be about what I was talking about. My understanding of what Louis Sullivan is saying here is that the living moment is the present moment, and our abstractions always need to be connected to the living. That this idea that we're starting with poetic imagination and broad sympathy, that we're starting with wonder and awe and a deep emotional connection to nature. That's even my understanding of the purpose or the function of why he's using so much florid language. You know, when Rob was talking about how the master teacher, has all of these really dense, exuberant explanations, and then the student character kind of summarizes them into a more pithy statement. That the whole purpose is that Louis Sullivan is saying we need to start with all of that exuberance. We need to start with the vital, emotional exuberance of nature, and that is happening in the present. And then once we're grounded in that, then we can build from that and have our abstractions that will connect that with the past and the future. That's my understanding.
Sherri?
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's always really helpful to remember Sullivan's timeline on this. He's writing this 7 years after. So when after the Chicago fire and Chicago was really building, and the Chicago school ideas, Sullivan part of a group of people creating these new ideas of what architecture could be with new materials that was fresh and new and completely different than what had come from before. That had been growing in Chicago for many, many years. Sullivan was, it was like 17 years in practice with Adler and others before him. So he's building hundreds and hundreds of buildings, and all in this same idea. And then the World's Fair comes, and the World's Fair brings all of it to a screeching halt of historicism. And it's sort of like sucked the air out of this vital, fresh look at architecture that was happening. And he writes this 7 years after that happened in Chicago. And all of a sudden, what he had been watching flourish and grow and really take hold, just sort of like, it's like somebody sprayed Roundup on it all, and everything just stopped. And so always keep in mind when he's talking about fresh and now, part of his thinking on that is the architectural context, where all of a sudden they stopped doing this and they started going back to the historic approaches again.
I want to add just one thing. Like, you have to take into account everything that he's saying. So one of the things that he's saying, focus on the present, is he's pushing back against the past. That's the most common thing that people do, is that they're just carrying over all the ideas and all the forms from the past. So he says, don't do that. In order to live, you have to reevaluate, or be prepared to reevaluate everything. I think the future is kind of contained in his present, because he's relentlessly focused on the nature of things and how things are growing. So that is kind of captured in that. So he's always thinking about the future. He's saying, okay, where is this form going? What does it need to do? And he's always focused on it. So he's saying, kind of keep recreating based on that.
Can I add? Oh, sorry. Maritza can go first, and then I wanted to just read another Louis Sullivan quote that I think ties into.
I just wanted to add in. So you talked about abstractions, and what Sullivan is saying here in this section, what he was saying to us was that he's talking about physical senses, is what he mentioned. And so when he's saying it's only in the present tense where you can really live, and it's only in the present tense where you can really think. I think that's, first of all, I think that's like super powerful. But I think what he's saying there is that he's equating that looking from the physical senses. So, abstractions are not what he's relating to in that moment when he's stressing the importance of real thinking.
I just want to read this one passage that I think, Louis Sullivan says this better than any of us ever could. So he says, the architecture we seek shall be as a man active, alert, supple, strong, sane, a generative man, a man having 5 senses all awake, eyes that fully see, ears that are attuned to every sound, a man living in his present, knowing and feeling the vibrancy of that ever-moving moment, with heart to draw it in and mind to put it out. That incessant, that portentous birth, that fertile moment which we call today, capital today, as a man who knows his day, who loves his day, who knows and loves the exercise of life, who rightly values strength and kindliness, whose feet are on the earth, whose brain is keyed to the ceaseless song of his kind, who sees the past with kindly eye, who sees the future in a kindling vision. As a man who wills to create, so shall our art be, for to live, wholly to live, is the manifest consummation of existence. Who could say it better than that?
That's what Louis Sullivan does. It's like, I was listening to what Joia was reading out, and it's just so incredible. And every time he will do that. Wonderful.
And then Rob's going to say something here, but let me just point out the poetry of that phrase, a kindling vision. There's a fire just beginning. I love that phrase. Go ahead.
Yeah,
So
the kindly eye and the kindling vision. That's beautiful poetry right there.
So think about always thinking in the present tense. Right just after that, he mentions, I have told you that real thought, vital thought, is born of the physical senses. Now, where he told us that was like a couple pages back in the chapter, Function of Form 1, part 1. And he talks about how through our senses, we know substantially all that we may know. The imagination, intuition, reason are but exalted forms of the physical senses. For man, there is nothing but the physical. What he calls his spirituality is but the most exalted reach of his animalism. Little by little, man through his senses divines the infinite. His highest thoughts, his most delicate yearnings arise through an imperceptible birth and growth from the material sense of touch. And he goes on about that a little bit. But so it's sort of an Aristotelian approach here that abstractions and the highest abstractions and ideas and concepts all arise from from observation, from the senses. And I think that's part of what he means by all thinking being in the present tense, is he means it all has to be tied down to what you yourself can observe through your own eyes. And so that sort of ties together the idea of the Aristotelianism, of the idea that all abstractions are based in your own perception, with the idea of it's your own independent firsthand perception. And that's why it has to be in the present. It has to be you looking out at the world and not somebody else looking at the world, 100 or 2,000 years ago and coming up with an idea and you just repeating that idea. So I think that's part of what he means by thinking being in the present sense, is thinking always has to be grounded in your own firsthand observation of the world.
Just and how well does that bring it right back to Montessori?
Wonderful. So I just want to give you, we are going to be talking about this Aristotelian view of senses tomorrow. This is going to be through Aquinas. Aquinas has the concept of cogitative sense, and we have Mark Barker who's writing an entire book on the cogitative sense of how our faculties are connected. And so that's going to be tomorrow at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. All right. Are there any more questions? Jonathan, you have more infinite, or have you exhausted all your questions?
If you guys are open to them, no,
yes,
if you're
go for
open,
it.
I'll ask more questions.
One more.
Yeah, okay.
One more.
All right, one more. Okay, all right. Well, I'm curious if anyone has, let me see. Yeah, okay. I'm curious if anyone makes a distinction between, I was just now thinking about there's purposeful thought and there's I think we mentioned disciplined. I saw in Rupali's presentation, you can be disciplined in the way you do things. So is there a difference between disciplined and purposeful thought? Or does someone make that distinction?
I would say, I think you need discipline to achieve your purpose. And I think that's something we're going to see. That would be how I would put it.
Wonderful. We'll get to that. We will have, he comes at it from many angles because he's really, talking about all of the faculties, all of the human faculties, as well as the entire of the human context, including the social. So he keeps on going between these things. And he's saying, you need all of this, you need all of this to be working properly. And that's what it's going to be about. All right, this has been amazing. All you guys, the presentations are just getting better and better. And so thank you very much. We have a meetup coming up at 5 o'clock.